all over again, and I've got 1,000 new ideas for my PhD, but they seem to be leading more towards neurology and stuff. So I don't know how this is going to work, but I wanted to share with you guys today a bit of research that I've been doing on specifically mental illness and how it can influence our perception of time, because there's actually quite a bit of research on this. And mental illness is not something that we typically control for in our research, obviously, because it's very difficult to do so with ethical concerns and actually finding the right materials to properly assess people. But it's definitely something that if we look at the framework of experiential relativity, it's definitely something that plays a role in our perception of the world, because if you have a different sort of neurological wiring to other people, or if you have different neurochemistry, then obviously your perception of the world is going to be different to others. So I did this for the third years this morning, and then I'm just going to do it for you guys. Oh, okay. I'm actually going to do this exercise with you guys because I thought it was quite a bit of fun. So what I'd like you to do, you don't have to write down your name and student number, but to just take out a piece of paper or your phone, whatever it is, something that you can make a note on, and write firstly 1, the tap, and then secondly 2, the piano.
So right.
Yeah, just write down the tap and the piano.
Yeah.
That's all it is. Let me just check that my sound works quickly. Okay, there we go, that should work fine. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you 2 videos, and I'd like you guys to just watch them. They're one after the other. So here we go. Okay, now there's a second video I'm going to show you. Okay, so now what I'd like you to do is to write down how long you think each video was. Okay, is everyone good? Oh, it's still going. Okay. Okay, does anyone want to share their answers? Alex.
I said they were basically the same time, 30 seconds each.
Okay. 20. 15 for both. No, this didn't work on you. In the first year class, yeah, I know you guys probably figured it out, but in the third year class, most of them actually said that the first video was longer than the second one. And the reason, yeah, far longer. So the reason for this typically is the fact that our brains are far more activated when there is something that is highly stimulated. Such as like the second video versus the first one. With the first video, there's nothing new happening. We sort of focus within a few milliseconds, and then the same thing occurs over and over and over again. So it seems, or it should seem, like it lasts longer. Whereas with the second video, there's so much visual stimulation and there's so much music and things going on that your brain is constantly activated, and thus it will typically feel shorter. And I actually thought about this morning with regards to sound perception. I thought that perhaps the same thing would work with sound perception, where if you played people slower pieces of music or more sort of standard bassline, I don't know how to explain it, music, they might perceive it as lasting longer than faster, more upbeat sort of music. But that's just an idea I had. Okay, so the next thing I want to look at is this. So apart from being famous, does anybody know what all of these people have in common?
Depression, some form of mental illness.
Some form of mental illness. Okay, so we've got all of these famous people up here who all struggle from mental illness in some way or form. So in terms of bipolar, we've got Carrie Fisher, Demi Lovato, Catherine Zeta-Jones, Russell Brand, Kurt Cobain, Jimi Hendrix, Ernest Hemingway, and Winston Churchill. Then Elton John struggles with bulimia. David Beckham and Leonardo DiCaprio struggle with OCD. And then in terms of schizophrenia, we've got Albert Einstein, Vincent van, I can never say it, Gogh, it's supposed to be the Dutch, Vincent van Gogh, and Syd Barrett, who is the lead singer of Pink Floyd. And they've all got schizophrenia. So what is very interesting, something I found this morning when I was doing the final minutes of preparation for this lecture. This lecture took me about 17 hours to prepare because I keep falling down rabbit holes. But what I found is that brain scans of highly creative people are very, very, very similar to brain scans of schizophrenic people. So it actually makes sense that our sort of big musical heroes and our artistic heroes would be on the sort of schizophrenic spectrum. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is neurodiversity. And this is a term that I came across. I'm not sure if any of you know, but I was actually in a psychiatric clinic throughout, was it May or June, for a few weeks. And I met the most amazing woman in there called Nicole. She was probably about 50 years old or so. And she introduced me to the idea of neurodiversity. So basically the idea behind neurodiversity is the fact that we sort of have this normal baseline for human beings, but then you also have a third of the population at least who have brains that are completely different from the sort of baseline. So these are people with, for example, things like there's a variation in sociability, so we'll see that in people with autism. You've got learning disabilities, so dyslexia, dyspraxia, and so on. Attention, so ADHD, we'll find that ADHD sort of patients tend to view time as going a lot faster than your average person. And then we've also got mood, so this is where you have your schizophrenia and your depression, your anxiety, and so on, and then other mental functions. So this is a term that was originally embraced by people on the autism spectrum, but it's now been expanded to include all sorts of mental illnesses and pretty much anything, any sort of variance in brain structure and cognition. So then I'd like to look at a few factors that can actually influence your time perception. And the first one is this really cool effect that I came across yesterday. I'm sure a few of you would have heard of it, called the Kappa effect. And I've got a little video to demonstrate it.
Take a look at these 3 flashing lights. As you can see, there are 2 white flashes and 1 red flash. We want you to pay attention to the interval of time between the flashes. There's 1 here between the first 2 flashes, and 1 here between the second 2 flashes. The question for you is, which of these 2 intervals of time is longer? Watch a couple more. Okay, can you tell which is longer? If you said the second interval is longer, you're right. Well, sort of. We're betting that your brain thinks it takes longer for the red light to appear. But here's the thing. The amount of time that passes between each flash of light is exactly the same. That's right. Both intervals are about half a second long. So, why did you think that the second pause was so much longer? It has to do with how your brain perceives distance and time.
This is what's known as the Kappa illusion, and it reveals how your sense of time can be influenced and distorted by your perception of distance. Notice the distance between the first 2 flashes of light. They're relatively close. Now look at the red flash of light. It's 3 times as far away, causing your brain to overestimate how much time has passed between them.
So why did you think that the second interval was so much longer?
And we think it might have to do with your brain's perspective on motion. If you've ever been to an auto racetrack, Your brain learns to expect a car moving at a certain speed to take a certain amount of time to go from point A to B. By putting the third flash further away, your brain altered your perception of how much time had passed, making the second pause seem longer because the red light must have traveled farther.
Okay, so now we can move on to, yes.
I just want to ask, do you think that only has a big influence on people who plot their timeline from left to right? And
That's a very good question, actually.
those who then plot it from top to bottom or from right to left? I don't know.
I wouldn't-
That's totally as influence. Do you think so?
I think it's more a matter of space. So I'm not sure if it would really matter in which direction it goes. It's more a matter of the distance between things. I'm not
So
sure.
because Anthropodisky did a study where they, so this is the same principle as the grown lines, yeah. Where they're dressed there, so they have lines growing from right to left as well, and up and down, and they still found an effect. However, there was no contrastive element there, so if they had tested people to right from right to left, maybe the effect would have been bigger with that group. But you still obtain the effect whichever way it goes.
Yeah. So now we can move on to neuropsychiatric conditions. Okay, so I've got a picture of Skyrim here. I don't know if anybody's ever played Skyrim, but the reason I've got it here is because I lost about 450 hours of my second year of university to Skyrim. Because it is such an amazingly immersive game, and this leads us to addiction. Okay, so in terms of social media addiction, I'm sure we all know that feeling when you lie on your bed and you're kind of, oh, I'll just spend 5 minutes on Facebook, and next thing it's 3 hours later and you haven't done any work. So with things such as addiction, because we become so immersed in something, and it's usually something that is highly stimulating to us, such as Facebook, where we've got constant new content coming, time actually seems to move a lot faster than if we are doing something more mundane. The same thing happens with gaming addiction. This is more of an immersion effect, because if you've ever played games, you'll know that you just get so involved in the game that you don't really think about anything else, and thus time seems to pass very quickly. And the same thing happens with alcoholism, because you often tend to lose hours and things like that. Then with eating disorders, I read a very interesting study about anorexia, where patients were given, they were presented with pictures of food and then also pictures of normal objects, like, I don't know, a chair or a cat or a dog, even though cats and dogs aren't objects. And they were presented on the screen, and they were on the screen for the same interval of time. But afterwards, the anorexic participants stated that the food images were present for a lot longer, which makes a lot of sense, because if you're in that frame of mind, your main focus in life is food. Is getting from one meal, or getting from one lack of meal to the next lack of meal, and working through that hunger, and time seems to slow down quite a bit as a result of that. And then, as I said to my class, I had a really nice photo up there, but I don't know what happened to it, so please excuse the massive white patch on the side there. Then let's have a look at depression, mania, and schizophrenia. I personally have experience with all of these, specifically depression and mania, and then I've got a few sort of schizophrenic tendencies as well. But with depression, we see that there are long periods of sort of hopelessness and emptiness. So it's different from your standard sadness, where you wake up, you're sad for a few hours, or you're sad for a day or two. It's long term, and it has really big effects on a person's life. So a lot of the time you can't get the motivation to do any work, you can't focus, you can't get out of bed, so on and so on and so on. And what we see in depressive patients is that they actually show a reduction in their time estimates. So they seem to think that time moves a lot slower than it actually does, which makes a lot of sense if you look at the sort of comorbidity of depression, where you have things like suicidal ideation. So moving through life is actually something that it's very difficult for depressed people to do. But then we have mania on the other side. For those of you who don't know what mania is, it's a very heightened sort of state of mind. Personally, I love being manic for the first couple of weeks, because I get so much work done, and I sleep maybe 4 hours a night. and I've just got energy. But usually mania is something that is very much associated with bipolar. So usually you'll see that bipolar patients will have periods of mania and then they'll go back down to depression when they crash from the mania. But while they are manic, they actually seem to see the world and see time as going a lot faster than when they are depressed. And then we've got schizophrenia. So this is characterized by things such as hallucinations and delusions. So an example I gave earlier was a schizophrenic person will sit and be drinking a bottle of water, and then maybe halfway through they'll look down and the bottle of water will melt out of their hands, or it'll set on fire or explode or something like that, which is obviously not something that can happen in reality, but a schizophrenic patient will see that happen. And so they have a very strong disturbance in their temporal cognition and their ability to judge between times. So a lot of the time they will know that an event occurred. So they will know that their mom had a birthday or that they had a birthday, but they actually won't be able to place it in time. And a lot of the time they can't even place it in terms of where an event happened. So this is obviously quite a big issue. Then I thought I'd focus on my specific personality disorder when looking at this. So I've got borderline personality disorder, which its main sort of characterization is the fact that there are sort of multiple selves and there is no real sense of identity. So I'm sitting here before you guys and I seem to have everything together, but I actually don't have like a single identity. I've got elements of myself that come out in different situations, and sometimes I'll be in a situation and I'll be in a sort of state of mind, and then I will be out of it and I won't remember what happened in that interaction until I'm back there with the same person, and then I flip back into that sort of state of mind. So there's a few characteristics of borderline. We've got affective emotional instability, so this is things like panic attacks and anxiety, then anger. Luckily I don't get that anger. Chronic feelings of emptiness, so it's this feeling that absolutely nothing matters, you know, I'm nothing, and so on. Impulsive acts, this is a very, very big thing in borderline. So that's things like gambling and spending money, just sort of reckless behaviors. And obviously these impulsive activities are things that usually a borderline personality disorder patient will seek exciting new impulsive activities. So from there we can already see where this is going, more towards the line of time seems to move a bit faster for them than it does for your average person. And then we've got recurrent self-harmful behaviors, gestures and threats, as I said already, the self-image issue, and then finally stress-related dissociative episodes. So in terms of dissociative episodes, this is something that isn't only a part of borderline personality disorder. Basically what it is that your consciousness is sort of disconnected from your reality. And this is usually something that happens as a result of trauma. So I've encountered quite a lot of emotional, psychological, sexual trauma in my life. And so as a defense mechanism for that, I developed what is called dissociative personality disorder. So what happens is that you take a traumatic event, and rather than dealing with it, you completely disconnect yourself from reality. And it's something that we see across trauma patients, including, so it's pretty much an overload response. So if you've been overseas and you're traveling and you go from art museum to art museum or place to place, you'll know that you get so tired because you've just seen so many things, and it's a sensory overload. So with dissociation, it's the same thing with your sort of personal experiences. So when your personal experiences become overloaded, then you just disconnect from reality altogether. And a lot of the time you can't remember what happened. So I've got a few months this year which have just gone. I have no idea what happened in those months as a result of a dissociative episode. So usually it's a result of things like trauma, borderline personality disorder, and also OCD. So there's a study I'd like to center in here which specifically looked at time perception in BPD patients. Basically what it did is that there were 19 BPD patients and 39 control patients. And they were all given a number of different measures. So for example, they've got a measure of time perception. They were also checked for impulsivity, because impulsivity is a big characteristic of BPD. Personality, because once again, what is your personality when you have BPD? Emotion, and then they also assessed the BPD characteristics. So what they would have done, what they would have done is that for each person, whether it was a BPD patient or a control, they would actually assess to see how many of these things could be ticked off on the list. And in order to have BPD, you have to have 5 of these. So that's how they managed to ensure that that the participants in the BPD group were actually BPD patients, and that your sort of controls were actually so-called normal. So they were also given the test, which was sensitive to orbifrontal cortex function. So it's not really important where in the brain this is or anything like that, but what we need to know is that this part of the brain is actually connected to both impulsivity and time perception. So we see that there's quite a strong link between these two things, even just neurologically. And then in terms of our results, so we see that BPD patients actually showed less time. They produced less time than controls. And they were also a little bit more erratic. They struggled a bit with actually judging what periods of times were compared to your so-called normal participants. But then something else they found was that a lot of the BPD characteristics can actually be seen as more on a continuum than anything else. So we've all got different levels of impulsivity. Some people are not at all impulsive. Some people like me are highly impulsive. And then you have the people in the middle as well. And this is something that makes an illness like BPD so difficult to diagnose, because a lot of people can look at these characteristics up here and you may say, oh yeah, I get really, really angry sometimes, or, you know, I have anxiety attacks, and sometimes I like to gamble and spend all my money in one go, these sorts of things. So there is quite a big spectrum, and that's why it's so difficult to diagnose BPD. But then another thing I found out about was dyschronometria. Yes, I got it right. I messed it up in class, even though I practiced it. I was so angry at myself. Okay, so basically what this is, it is sort of a syndrome, I guess, where we are unable to keep track of time. So this is a result of cerebellar dysfunction. So we can't accurately estimate time that has passed. And we also have lowered spatial awareness. Our short-term memory is a little bit messed up, and it's very difficult for us to keep time as a result of this. And we see dyschronometria across different patients, usually those who have been in some form of physically or mentally traumatic sort of situation. So for example, if you've been in a car accident, you'll know that time seems to go a lot slower in those moments of the car accident than it actually did. And then we also see that there is a higher incidence in the elderly due to deterioration of brain matter with age. Deterioration. Okay, with age. So I've got an example there from my own life. Those of you who know me know that I'm highly, highly organized, and I've got to-do lists everywhere, and my calendar is constantly just perfect. But this year I clearly completely lost track of time, because one of the last things I remember was changing this calendar on about the 4th of April, because it was sitting on I think it was sitting on February, and I hadn't changed it through March, and then I thought, oh, it's April, I need to change it. And then when I came out of clinic, I looked at this and I was like, April, that's so unlike me, because usually I'm, you know, down to the day. But this is just a sign of how much I lost track of time through, you know, that whole episode, and through the trauma of having like a complete dissociative episode. So I looked at a few statistics, and it made me really sad, actually, to find out that there are 17 million plus people in South Africa who struggle with various forms of mental illness. The most prevalent of these are depression, substance abuse, anxiety, bipolar, and schizophrenia. So you wouldn't imagine that this is the case. You might think, okay, depression, substance abuse, and anxiety. But bipolar and schizophrenia rates are actually a lot higher than we think that they are. And then 1/3 of the population suffers from mental illness. And 75% of these people will never be as lucky as I was, where I was able to actually get treatment. Most of these people will never, ever, ever get treatment. And obviously, if we see that there is such a large proportion of the population who struggle from mental illness, and if mental illness has such an influence on our perception of time, then it is something that we should potentially be taking into account in our research on experiential relativity. However, there are a lot of issues that come up as a result of this. The first of which is screening issues. So when it comes to psychological assessment, there are so many different tools that can be used. And if we are to start researching neurodiversity in our sort of psycholinguistic experiential relativity frame, we need to have some form of standardized test so that across studies we are able to actually assess these effects. And then there's also the volatility of diagnoses. So I was saying earlier that BPD, for example, impulsivity is more of a spectrum than it is anything else. And this is the problem because a lot of people may exhibit symptoms of a mental illness, but they may not actually have that mental illness. Because it's very difficult to actually diagnose mental illnesses because you can't see them unless you conduct brain scans, which are highly, highly expensive. Then we've also got methodological issues. As I said, brain scans, very, very expensive. So if we were to use those, it would actually, it's not really something that we can do at this point in time. And then secondly, we have stigma. So that's something that I'm desperately trying to break down, especially with the undergraduate students, because mental illness is such a prevalent thing, but it's so highly stigmatized. And a lot of people won't come forth for research because of that stigma, because they don't want to be labeled as depressed or, mentally ill or broken or all of those terrible sort of labels. And then we also have the ethical issues, as I'm sure you guys are all aware. So how exactly do we go about getting clearance for something like this, especially if we're not trained professionals in psychological fields? It's something that is incredibly difficult to get. So these are now a few issues that we're going to face before actually being able to look at neurodiversity in the context of experiential relativity. And that's everything from me. I would like to hear what you guys have to say on this topic. Yes.
It's very interesting.
Cool.
I loved it, and you said 75% of the population do not get.
Yeah, 75% of the third of the population, yes.
And I find that very painful because back home, if you have a mental disorder, then you're either an attention seeker or you're being bewitched by somebody's grandmother. So it's the kind of stigma that we don't want to talk about it because it does not exist.
Yeah.
So I think it's very, very, very sad. Because when I told my grandmother that I was coming to school, she was like, "You're going to get crazy with all of that study. You shouldn't do that because you're going to go crazy." So I feel like if more people would come out, then it would be better to just spread the word and the awareness about it. So I feel like that's great work you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. 'Cause, I mean, can you imagine if that third of the population talked about it openly? No, it wouldn't be a stigma at all.
Something that people had to get treated.
Yeah, it's like having leg pain. I have leg pain. Yeah, I've got depression. Like it's.
It's like I saw a post on Facebook. It was from a psychologist. He said going to a psychologist should be akin to going to a doctor. If you have a specific problem, you go to a professional's trained to deal with it. It shouldn't be this whole, I can only go to a psychologist if I'm having a mental breakdown or depressed or I'm anxious. It should be a regular occurrence.
Absolutely, it's for your health.
But it's more of an opinion question. Since there's since the brain of like your artists and your artistically inclined individuals is akin to that of schizophrenics, would you say it could be probably that maybe it's just we try to force people to fit into specific molds of like you have to be this or you have to be that, you can't exist within your own creative world? Could that be a reason for the problem?
I think there is a bit of a thing there, but just being a very creative, like this is my personal I don't know if this applies to everyone, but just from my perspective, being somebody who has sort of schizophrenic tendencies and also being highly creative, I see exactly how they interplay, because I see the world as, I can look out there and if I wasn't around everybody else, I'd probably hallucinate a few things, and they're creative things that feed into my artworks. So having that sort of different perception of the world and different, ability to see things just completely different to other people, it really does impact on artwork as well. It gives you ideas that other people maybe wouldn't be able to come up with. Yeah. But I'm not sure, that's just anecdotal. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just ask what you mean by schizophrenic?
So I end up with hallucinations quite a bit of the time. Like small things, I didn't realize that I actually had them until very recently, or until when I was in clinic and I started talking about them with people. And when I would realize that somebody would maybe walk past, but nobody else would see them walk past. Or I would hear a noise, but nobody else would hear the noise. It's small things that have always happened in my life that I didn't realize were hallucinations. And they don't bug me. I mean, I'm not bothered by them at all. I quite like it. But
People at the clinic told you that it's going to get worse.
no.
That it will develop into schizophrenia.
No, because I've got borderline. My brain, my sort of neurological makeup is not that of a schizophrenic person. I just have those tendencies as a result of my borderline. Yeah.
It's quite scary to hear that.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it as to be negative. It's
Yeah.
just that I learned about schizophrenia earlier, and it's not fun.
It's not fun, no, but kind of learn to accept it as a part of the creative process. That's what I've done.
As influences force schizophrenia. So a lot of people are seeing things, telling me to other people.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I've had it when I've had voices telling me to hurt myself, but I've never had it with other people. It's quite rare actually to have voices telling you to hurt other people. That's more along the sort of psychopathic spectrum. Yeah. Most schizophrenics it's self-destructive tendencies.
Do you think it could be something to do with the manic depressive side as well, that the voice tells you to hurt yourself?
Yes, very much so, with the impulsivity and self-destructive tendencies. Yeah.
With the, if you can go back to the slide where you, yeah, that's one.
That one.
Yes. So, psychological tools. I mean, depending on whether you want to research it or not, but you might be able to avoid the diagnosis difficulties, because so suppose that, for instance, you talked about time perception and impulsivity. So there I looked into this a couple of years ago when I was busy putting together a project on tense, like future tense and present tense, and delayed discounting. So if you get to choose, I'll pay you 50 Rand today or 100 Rand in a month's time. And what do you choose? And if you have impulsivity control more so, then you choose to wait. And if you don't have that, and there are actually tests, freely available tests that yield, it's called the K coefficient. The K coefficient basically is a measure of delayed gratification or delayed discounting. So that it asks these questions in 50 different ways, and then it calculates how much you can actually wait for something. So you don't need to run or resort to diagnosis and stuff for that, but you can actually just, if you want to correlate it with something. So the idea here was, we were going to look at, this is that if you speak a few